I'm actually quite surprised that this mission went ahead the way it did so well.
Europe chose China for planetary infrastructure protection, and the US did not have a seat at the table. That represents a rare, if not unique, development.
This is what makes it different, is that the contributions are approximately even between the Europeans, ESA, and the Chinese.
We're seeing a concrete example of two major areas of the world working together to exactly build a community with a shared future for mankind.
The more we build trust at the scientific level and at the institutional level of science institutes and even at governmental levels, then you have a basis for progress.
The European Space Agency puts so much more emphasis on science missions. That's something that China can learn and really needs to learn. On the other side, China has been developing rockets very rapidly, reusable, cheap. This will be a win-win situation if the two can get together and figure out a way to move forward.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Smile! A joint China-Europe satellite is about to capture something we've never seen before. Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyun. Joining me for a chat on the latest Sino-European collaboration in space exploration, Professor Quentin Parker, Director of the Lab for Space Research, University of Hong Kong, Professor Zhang Fan, Associate Professor of Astronomy, Beijing Normal University, and Professor Andy Monk of Beijing Foreign Studies University, who's also a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. It's a great pleasure to have you all back for the chat, professors. So first, a quick question to Andy. The SMILE mission is described as a rare case of China-Europe cooperation in space. How rare is this, and why has it been so limited, Andy?
Sure, Yun. Well, it is pretty rare. And, I think the headline really writes itself, doesn't it? So Europe chose China for planetary infrastructure protection. And we will dive into what that means. And the US did not have a seat at the table. So I think, that in and of itself, I think represents a rare, if not unique, development in the history of international relations or great power relations, if I may call it that. The SMILE is an acronym, and it also is a mouthful. Solar, Wind, Magnetosphere, Ionosphere, Link, Explorer. And, you mentioned, Yun, this is very important in that it is the first fully integrated space mission between Europe and China from conception through operation. And it is very practical, too, because it may sound, very esoteric, very scientific, but its goal really is quite simple, and it's to better understand space weather and improve warning of solar storms. Because just like storms on Earth, tsunamis, hurricanes, things like that, solar storms can also cause enormous damage all around the world.
Right, thanks for the explanation, and we'll come back to the broader partnership later in the show. But for now, let's zoom in on the mission itself. Like Andy just mentioned, the full name of the satellite is called Solar Wind Magnetosphere Ionosphere Link Explorer. So, Fan, how excited are you, and what brought China and Europe together for this mission in the first place?
Right. So this satellite, obviously, the acronym is they're trying to make the name to fit the acronym. I don't know what ionosphere is doing in there, but anyhow, what this satellite is trying to do is to look at the solar wind. So the sun, you should consider the sun as an exposed nuclear reactor. It's blasting not just sunlight, not just light, but also charged particles towards Earth. The Earth is protected by this thing called the magnetic field of Earth deflects the charged particles, and these charged particles gets funneled in to the polar regions and becomes the aurora. This is the mechanism by which Earth is protected from this solar wind. Otherwise, if you look at Mars, it's a smaller planet, it's cooled on the inside, so its magnetic field, global magnetic field is gone, which means the solar wind, when it blows away all the sort of charged particles in its atmosphere, and then Mars ended up with hardly any atmosphere left. So that's not happening on Earth because we have this protection.
Right.
So learning how this magnetic field and charged particles in it together, they form this magnetosphere. How does that interact with the solar wind? Tells you scientifically about how planets sort of atmosphere evolves in the longer term. But in the short term, like Andy already mentioned, when you have a extreme solar event, like an eruption, like a flare, how badly would Earth be affected? So this is kind of a planetary defense thing that we have to learn. And the reason why China and Europe work together is because we have the technology and they fit together perfectly. And for this kind of studies, it's quite expensive. So you want to be able to share the cost. And for this mission, it's very evenly divided. So the Europeans, they would make two of the most fundamental instruments like the X-ray and ultraviolet observers. And then China side makes the satellites that goes around them. And then Europe makes the further sort of a payload module around that, and also the rocket. So it's like an onion with alternative layers made by alternative sides. So it's heavy, deep integration, which is why this case is so different from previous cases. But in any case, this kind of infrastructure allows perfect sharing of cost as well as the concentration of expertise where it lies. So you get the best from either side.
Right. Quentin, I bet you've been following this very closely. And do you think both sides actually play their advantage to pull in this regard?
Look, this is, as was said earlier, it is quite a rare example in certain ways, but don't forget that China's space program has multiple international collaborators on all kinds of missions. I mean, there's many experiments on the Chinese space station which have different kinds of international partners, not just from Europe, but from elsewhere too, from BRICS countries increasingly now. And the International Lunar Research Station has got that too. So this is one where it's actually 50-50. So this is what makes it different, is that the contributions are approximately even between the Europeans, ESA, and the Chinese. And so I think that's what makes it special. And as has already been described, the way the mission's been divvied up is amongst the different kinds of expertise. But this mission was first thought about quite a number of years ago, and it's taken a while to get to fruition now. It was meant to launch in French Guiana using an Ariane rocket. And so you look at the different kinds of expertise. So I'm very happy about this collaboration. I hope it will lead to other, when the world is very complex at the moment, as we all know, and various things are happening which we didn't foresee when this mission started. So a lot has changed in the geopolitics, and so the pressures and things around it have changed too. But at least this is a non-controversial, for the benefit of humanity, for understanding our magnetosphere interactions with the solar wind and its impacts on life, and all kinds of different systems are understood to some degree, but this will certainly help improve that enormously. So I think it's a very important scientific mission for the world, for science, being led by two major space powers. I mean, China's emerged even more strongly as a major space power since this mission was first conceived. And, and Europe is still a player. It hasn't had many launches lately, but it's still a player with a lot of expertise in many European countries. They're excellent putting together payloads. I mean, the scientific payloads are dominated by Europe's, and the platform, and around which a payload is housed is being done by China, etc. So it's a true partnership playing to the strengths at that time when it was conceived. Things have developed since then a bit, but nevertheless, I see this as an exemplar case of excellent scientific collaboration, putting aside any other issues that there might be, to concentrate on the science this will deliver for our understanding of space weather.
You mentioned it'll benefit the whole world or humanity. Can you give us some more specific examples? I think Fan already mentioned some, but give us more concrete examples like what ordinary people can benefit from it.
It has a lot of scientific goals on this mission that will help us to, I don't believe science has any borders. This is certainly a case where I think you could adapt that. I mean, the major scientific goal is to study how the Earth's magnetosphere protects our planet from the solar wind, and using both novel X-ray and UV technologies. They're all high energy photons. UV photons are higher energy in optical, and then X-rays is even higher energy. And it was, I think it was a top scientific candidate of 13 missions proposed. Any mission that gets approved is always in competition with other missions also want to get approval. So it's a kind of a true scientific competition to pick out the winners. And this was picked out a winner because it has real life impact on the Earth. Solar storms in the past have created enormous problems. I mean, there's some very important things that happened even way back. There was, I think, the most important one that's ever been recorded in modern history was the so-called Carrington event in 1859. It was the most solar powerful solar storm we've ever had. But back in 1859, we don't have the modern technology we have today. So even though the impacts were significant of all the, on all the strong electric currents being generated, induced in people doing telegrams and telegraphs and paper catching fire and things, even when they're unplugged, things working. It was so an analogy today, if that's a Carrington event, a massive coronal ejection was to hit the Earth today, could decimate a lot of our technology, both in low Earth orbit in terms of our satellites being made redundant and not functioning anymore, but also, the other things it can have. It can impact even things like subsea cables and things like that. It's deep sea internet cables can be affected, not the fiber optics themselves, but the electronic repeaters that they have that power and booster signals. They can go. Aviation, maritime navigation can go. Railway signaling systems, be the long metal tracks, induced currents that can create problems. Oil and gas pipelines. There's also satellite operations in particular, which I care deeply about, and I care about space debris being an issue for space sustainability. But massive coronal storms can have a similar impact in certain ways on the delicate electronic systems that some of these satellites have. So this is what we need to understand, and we can help protect by understanding these things much better.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Andy, can you have an economic interpretation of this? In value terms, how may this help humanity or help a country economically?
Well, so I think first we have to look at, what is the potential economic exposure? And, I've seen some estimates that, it's in the trillions of dollars, $2 trillion and more. And, here's why, because I think as Quentin was saying, what such a powerful storm would do, solar storm or eruption, would fry, to use a very colloquial word, pretty much everything we use, right? Computers, GPS, and I believe even we might even lose electricity, sometimes maybe some estimates for months. So if you think about a world where you've lost power, electrical power, all the infrastructure of modern life that we rely on all went away, again, for up to months, that would be disastrous, not just economically, but I think even from a social perspective as well, and, could very well become an enormous humanitarian disaster. So, I think that this makes this not just a scientific mission, but this has enormous practical importance. And we can think about it like this. In Los Angeles, people, live above the San Andreas Fault, and everyone knows that one day there will be the big one, the big earthquake. And I think scientists say the same thing about these Carrington disruptions as well, or eruptions, in that it's not will this happen, but it's when. And so I think what China is doing here is working with Europe to say, look, somebody needs to do something to build planetary infrastructure. And I think the first step here, as Quentin was saying, is that first understand how the phenomenon works in the magnetosphere. But the goal is to obviously, one, provide longer lead time. So now we might only know in minutes or hours, but perhaps through this research powered by artificial intelligence, by the way, can give, the authorities, the people in charge of keeping us safe from these things, days and maybe even weeks. And that would just be the first step, and perhaps even more how to build more resilient systems. And then I think from a broader geopolitical perspective, we hear about this building a community with a shared future for mankind. And, it's not abstract rhetoric, but it really is an operational reality in this case, because we're seeing a concrete example of two major areas of the world working together to exactly build a community with a shared future for mankind by protecting us from these events that we know for sure will happen, but we just don't know when.
Right. We don't want to be too technical on this, but still there are some breakthroughs we need to elaborate a little bit about this project. And SMILE will use some soft X-ray imaging to photograph Earth's magnetosphere for the first time. So tell us what that is, why that is a breakthrough.
So those are high energy photons. Those are high energy lights.
Right.
To emit those things, you need high energy particles. So which means it's tracking what sort of solar charged particles from the sun being ejected from the sun into our atmosphere, into our magnetosphere, and how does that interact with the magnetic field and then radiate these photons. The reason why it's a new thing is because in the past, when you were learning the magnetosphere, you tend to send a satellite that fly through it and sort of just collect the data on the local electrical field potential, things like that. A more local point-wise information. This time, by looking at the radiation from the entire magnetosphere from a global view, you sort of begin to better understand the structure of it. Because when you have this kind of magnetospheres, there's something called current sheets that are important. So they're very, very tiny little regions, but there's a lot of current flowing through it. They appear and disappear kind of quite randomly, but they form the basic backbone of the whole infrastructure of the magnetosphere.
Okay.
By understanding them, being able to track them, you understand how the magnetosphere, our Earth's magnetic field, reacts to the solar wind. And this falls back into the earlier discussion. So we can see that the sun is doing something, and then we can forecast in advance that, for example, several days later, there's a whole bunch of particles going to hit Earth. But what do we do? Do we shut everything down, wait it to pass? How is it going to affect us at all? To learn that information, we need to understand how the magnetosphere actually behaves globally, how its dynamic works when it's bombarded by the solar winds. And this global picture, through looking at the UV and the soft X-ray information, is trying to understand that, how the dynamics works when it's bombarded.
So before this launch, we actually could barely see all those things, you mean?
Yeah, because the UV-wise, the Earth's upper atmosphere is... So basically, we don't have UV astronomy for the reason that there's a lot of UV light coming in, background noises and everything. You sort of need to go into space to be able to see them more properly.
Right. And then Quentin, in the long run, how do you expect this research to support future missions then?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think fundamentally, the research results that will come out over the lifetime of this mission, I think will be extremely impactful. We've heard a lot about it already, and I think the use of soft X-ray imaging is an area that China is now getting involved with, of course, with its own Einstein probe X-ray telescope, which is based on lobster eye technology. It's very different here on this mission, but it's going to, as was said by Professor Fan, it enables the first ever continuous global photographing of what happens when you have an interaction between the particles of the solar wind and the Earth's magnetic shield. Now, the humans notice this. Well, now they understand the physics of it as aurora borealis and aurora australis in the northern and southern poles. Now, that normally when there is aurora, it restricts itself to northern and southern latitudes near the poles. But when these storms get really intense, those aurora go further and further south. And, in the Carrington event, back in the 19th century, they went as far south as Texas. So in the States. So, and the recent very severe storms have also gone much further south. So that's an indication of the severity of the storm. But what SMILE is going to give the scientific community is, as was said, the first global view of this invisible shield, but also how that invisible shield reacts under stress when you have these massive solar storms or coronal mass ejections coming towards the Earth in our direction. If that unfortunate thing happens, and we know that it's just like a ticking clock waiting for the next huge one to directly impact the Earth. How impactful could it be? What if it was even more powerful than what happened with the Carrington event? How would that impact on all our technologies that we rely on so much today? And it could be months. I think Quebec lost a lot of power once to a solar storm for quite a long time. And if that happened during winter, that's a very serious impact. So, of course, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand these interactions in a lot more detail to help for planning, to help for modeling, for early warning signs of what's coming. And when you combine our better models of the Earth's magnetosphere with better modeling and understanding of the impact of coronal mass ejections that come our way, not just a normal solar wind, but massive events, then that gives us more of a chance to understand how we should do. Do we, in fact, have enough warning to turn critical systems off, to put satellites into safer orientations and all kinds of different things? Because what we need to understand here is, things like magnetic reconnection, and how magnetic field lines come and go and how they connect and disconnect. It's a major goal that we have scientifically to help to understand how solar wind energy and mass get ejected into the Earth's magnetic sphere and how that creates magnetic field lines and breaks them, and then when they reconnect. So that's actually really important. So we're going to have real-time monitoring of solar wind as well. So that's going to give us advance warning of attacks that are imminent from such events, and therefore, and also how it changes the dynamics and the morphology of the magnetosphere and how quickly it can recover, what lasting effects there might be and how long they last. And therefore, all these things pile into the mix of helping us to understand what is a very complex process.
The incident you mentioned in Quebec in Canada, the electricity outage, it seems it doesn't happen that frequently, right? So is it worth it?
There's a solar cycle, we go through solar max and solar min over a period of a solar cycle, and it's been known for a long time now. But these things have a cycle, but they're not uniform and they're not the same strength. They don't have the same depth, and sometimes the number of sunspots that you see changes and all these things. So the Quebec blackout was back in, I think, 1989, and that's perhaps the most famous modern example of a severe solar storm and the impact it had. It basically knocked out the Hydro Quebec power grid in Canada. And for over 9 hours, I think the entire province was plunged into darkness in Canada for over 9 hours. And if, transformers can blow up and then they could take weeks to repair. And so, also at that time, we did have satellites, not as many as we have now, but there was quite a few satellites up there in 1989. And that severe storm did damage quite a lot of satellites, even the space shuttle, I think, the Discovery, I think, was up there about that time. And that had issues with its sensors. So if there's manned spaceflight going on during a severe solar storm, the humans on board will get a lot of radiation, which is really damaging, can be. And also the systems can be very badly affected too. So I think the most recent one was just a couple of years ago. There was a really strong storm in 2024, but there's been a lot of aurora in the last few months that have been quite significant. So, these things are difficult to predict, but we know when solar maximum is, so we know the likelihood that we're going to probably have more activity than less.
Right. And then you mentioned the venue of the launch site. It's in Guyana Space Center in French Guiana. So can you tell us more about this launch site and why is it chosen?
Well, it's chosen because, if you look at the map of the Earth and you look at the galactic latitudes, French Guiana is about 5 degrees north of the equator. So what that does, if you launch from launch systems close to the equator, you benefit the most from the Earth's rotational velocity, which is about 460 meters per second around that point. And therefore you get a kind of aid to the launch. You're able to have an increased payload for a given fuel consumption and thrust from your rocket through a slingshot effect. So you get increased payload capacity while reducing fuel requirements. So that is one of the major advantages of launching from close to the Earth's equator. Of course, you've also got the infrastructure there that the French have built. It's an overseas department of France, so it's also the official spaceport for the whole of the European Space Agency. I mean, China's got at least 4 major launch sites now, including a couple in Hainan Island, just south here of Hong Kong, where I am, including a commercial one that they've commissioned. And so, it has advantages in safety and geography. There's a safe flight path. There's not much interference for launches which are going eastward like that. Also, because it's going over the oceans, you get rocket stages can fall back safely to Earth into the ocean, not in avoiding most populated areas. So there's little gains like that as well. And from that physical location on the Earth's surface, you can put satellites into quite a range of different kinds of orbits, including this one, the SMILE, which is actually quite a high inclination orbit, as it turns out, for this mission. So they're the major advantages, actually.
Okay. And let's move on to the significance and the outlook of China-Europe cooperation in space exploration. SMILE is also called China's first mission-level in-depth cooperation with the European Space Agency. I believe it's already mentioned. But Fan, what does that actually mean, and why is it significant?
So yeah, there have been a lot of European instruments on Chinese missions in the past. For example, on the Chang'e missions, almost each one of them had a foreign component on it. But the key difference is that in those cases, those instruments are standalone, sort of plug and play parts. So if for some reason they don't turn up, you can swap it with something else and the mission wouldn't be jeopardized. So that's a sort of a lower level of trust that this thing would go ahead without a hitch. And this time, this is mission critical. So if either side has any problem, the mission is a no-go at all. So that's a far deeper sort of trust level in terms of, because, if it doesn't go and you spend all that money, spend all that effort, a lot of people's entire careers are in this thing. That's a huge investment. And you require the kind of trust that goes with that.
Right. And I think also Quentin mentioned that this project faced some delays. if my memory serves me correctly.
It was first selected in 2015.
Ultimately, it moved forward. So, Andy, what message do you think this result, if you will, actually send in today's complex geopolitical climate?
Well, I think, we're all well aware of I would say maybe perhaps the ambivalence that Europe has with China. But I think here, it's a great example of pragmatism in that this was really, not decided based on sentiment, but, again, on pragmatism, that something really needed to be done to protect the planetary infrastructure. The US has been drawing back from this and I think pulled back from a very major project with Europe to go to Mars. So I think, again, this is, I think, why Europe partnered with China for this particular project. But I think it also points to something larger than a single launch. And I think it shows, first of all, that in an age of, I wouldn't say that's just strategic rivalry, but certainly, again, I would probably use the word ambivalence. Some forms of cooperation are still possible because the incentives are too strong and the risks are too large. So I think, I see that as a positive. And then if we look at it from the perspective of China-EU relations, I think repeated positive interactions can create deeper rapport, deeper mutual understanding, greater mutual trust, and then that perhaps can be used to strengthen the overall relationship moving forward and perhaps will make areas, where there are disagreements or gaps easier to bridge.
This has been the Chat Lounge. We'll explore future opportunities for China-Europe cooperation in space right after the break. Stay with us.
From the refreshing cup of tea that starts your morning, to the paper that you write on, the roots of many familiar parts of modern life can be traced back to ancient ideas.
2 crates of tea and dumped the whole thing straight into the ice. Rice even served as currency in 794. A new paper mill was founded in the Abbasid.
Across mountains, deserts, and oceans, these creations shaped the world then and continue to influence all of us today. Join us on Made in Ancient China and discover how ideas born millennia ago became some of the world's greatest treasures.
Welcome to Made in Ancient China. We hope you enjoyed this journey.
Made in Ancient China brings you stories of human ambition, inspiration, and connection. Now available on all major podcast platforms.
Welcome back. We continue our chat on Sino-European collaboration in space exploration.
Andy mentioned something I care a lot about, and amongst what he said, the good things that he was saying. And for me, the most important word of all was the word trust.
Right.
When you have trust and you've developed it, so you know you can rely on them holding up their end, and they can rely on you holding up your end, and you can almost take it for granted. You develop that trust amongst your teams, and that is so, so valuable. And when it's on something of an international nature between international partners, then that's also extremely important for the future. So I hope that, something of this significance for understanding our planet's magnetospheric health and the impact it can have through severe solar storms on our modern way of life is a fundamentally important thing for that whole process. We've heard about the dangers, the risks, and the problems that would occur if we don't have a decent early warning and we don't know what remediating actions we should take in advance, etc. Then we'd lose a lot more. I mean, what Andy Mock said about the economic costs are absolutely spot on. It's incalculable. Even the new space economy, where all the low Earth orbit satellites are, and that could be either destroyed by the Kessler syndrome of cascading catastrophic collapse by space debris, or through a massive solar storm, incapacitating large numbers of satellites so they go out of orbit and crash into each other and then create the Kessler syndrome anyway. That's a nearly $2 trillion economy by 2035. Right. But the on-ground costs of all these things would also go into the trillions. Also, social unrest and social issues and problems could eventuate. When people, funnily, their mobile phones don't work for a few days, people start to get really cranky. And I think that some nations have been, modeling social unrest If the mobile phones are all taken away, I'll stop working. And so it's quite sobering to think of all of these issues and how much depends on your ability to rely on partners, to share data properly, to cooperate sensibly, and to understand there can be win-win. It doesn't have to be losers, us or them, you or me. It can be win-win. And I think we don't have enough of that. And the more we build trust at the scientific level and at the institutional level of science institutes and even at governmental levels about things which they can consider, oh, it's not controversial, this is for the good of humanity and everything. It's not about national security. It's not about militarization. It's not about economic damage. It's about fundamental issues to safeguard our planet and our way of life. Then you have a basis for progress.
I understand that, and I also believe that scientists from both sides have trust in each other. But when there is something else or something non-scientific getting into the way, things will change, if you will. And during this process, what kind of difficulties did scientists have to overcome to reach what they have today? Do you have any knowledge of that?
If you're addressing it to me, I mean, we're living in, I would say, interesting times. And even today, there's so many things happening that the whole world order has been flipped in some senses in the last year or so. And things are getting increasingly complicated, very difficult to predict what's going on. Established orders, assumptions about what people will do under what circumstances have been eroded. Trust is being eroded. Dependency has been shown up in serious ways between different nation states. So this is all geopolitics, as we know. And
Right.
As a scientist, trying not to get involved in politics at all, because I don't want to get involved
But
in
you have
politics.
to face it.
Everybody has to face it, and we have to face the reality of what the world is turning into. And the question is, what do we do about it? How do we preserve and protect the good things that we're all trying to do together as a scientist, as a social scientist, as an astrophysicist, as a space scientist, as somebody that cares about the rules-based order and international law and United Nations and all these things? How do we deal with everything that's going on? I'm just one person. Governments and policies and presidents and prime ministers and all of these people decide what's the best thing to do for their country, their jurisdiction, their government, whatever, and people like me making comments about that is not, I don't think, going to really make any difference. But all I can see is the impacts of it. I have opinions about what should be done or what could be done and what might help, what might hinder, and all these kinds of things are out there. And I know that every member of this panel is probably concerned about what's going on and wonder about the future, wonder about scientific cooperation.
Indeed.
When you hear about looking at what's happening with climate change, and issues there around the world. And, I look at China and what China's done in terms of changing from fossil fuels to renewables and electric cars everywhere and better public infrastructure and transport. They're putting vast sums of money into all of that for their people and for the planet. And I think that's something that other countries could aspire to in terms of getting away from the reliance on fossil fuels. And if we didn't rely on them so much, maybe what's happening today wouldn't be so much of an issue either.
Right. Fun. Like Quentin just mentioned, there is also concerns there. Though the small project is now coming to fruition, Joseph Ashbaka, ESA Director General, said, at the moment, there is no discussion of a follow-up mission. So with no follow-up mission currently planned, Fan, do you have any concern that this cooperation between China and Europe could lose momentum?
Not really. I mean, I think he's mentioning not just about following up to this particular SMILE mission,
Right.
where he's talking about this. Also, there's nothing in the pipeline that combines the two countries' space programs as much as this program currently is doing. But there have been some hiccups. I'm actually quite surprised that this mission went ahead the way it did so well, because you ask whether I know of some problems they may have had, recently. I don't know about them, but we certainly had problems. So last year, my student in Europe was basically prevented from entering the lab. They didn't ban it, but they require extra clearance and all that for Chinese nationals, and the bureaucracy surrounding that turned out to be so ad hoc, and they just didn't bother. So that certainly had the problem. So you can imagine the same thing, because it's a Europe-wide directive. So they must have had that problem as well. They pushed through, which is quite good. They had to have it launched in time because, the solar cycles are just such that you want the sun to be particularly active when you're launched, and you can't miss another 11-year window. wait another 11 years for that.
Mm.
So they certainly did a lot of good job. And I hope, this is a good example that whatever difficulties can be overcome. And, although there's nothing currently being planned, so in the future, somebody can push through it's all rather random. The direction is unclear at the moment. We're walking in fog, but hopefully, people with vision can push through harder than we could.
Right, Andy, I think at the beginning you specifically mentioned that China and Europe actually did this without the United States taking part. Given the U.S. role in geopolitics, no matter whether it's involved in or Sino-European scientific cooperation, it seems its influence is there. So do you think this kind of cooperation between China and Europe could somehow come to a pause? We know that China has invited Europe to take part in building the International Lunar Research Station. While the ESA has expressed the support in principle, it hasn't formally joined. What do you think ESA is concerned about, and what's the likelihood of such cooperation being carried out in the future?
Yeah, well, I think the issues are largely political and not technical and scientific. So I'm not a scientist,
Right.
But what I understand is that, there is enormous respect for Chinese scientific, technological competence at the individual level, but also at the organizational level as well. So I think that, there's certainly, at least my understanding or my observation, is there certainly is the interest, but it's the political obstacles that are in the way. And in particular, it is, again, I think Europe becoming increasingly conflicted about how it should move forward with China, because in some sense, as I'm sure we all know, it has been caught in the middle with the U.S. giving it a lot of pressure, not just Europe, but other countries around the world, to side with the U.S. and not China. But especially in this second Trump administration, we've seen unimaginable things happen, I think, that have caused many European political leaders to be alarmed and I think really facing an existential crisis about what to do to move forward. And, if you look at it that way, things could go either way. It could be a reversion back to the U.S. But, according to some observers, if they're correct, it's a ratchet, right? So it's ratcheted one way and you can't really go back. That Europe has much greater incentives, not just from a material perspective, but you think about things like trust, credibility, consistency. It really couldn't be more different night and day, if we were to compare the U.S. to China in this regard recently.
Okay.
So, again, we don't really know how the future will turn out, but certainly I think Europe is having a very serious rethink about how to cooperate with China in many, many different important areas.
Right. It seems Fan and Quentin are both optimistic, I should say. It's a little bit to my surprise, especially under this kind of a global political atmosphere. Then I'll ask both of you, Fan, what kind of cooperation between the two sides can we see in the near future then?
Well, I'm no expert in politics, but it looks so far like Europe has been more doing its own things, and hopefully when outside pressure, third-party pressure, etc., become less of a concern, scientific merit gets more of a consideration, and I really look forward to be able to work with Europe, because they, compared to the other space agencies, the European Space Agency puts so much more emphasis on sort of science missions. They basically don't do human explorations. All they do is science, and they do it really, really well. That's something that China can learn and really needs to learn. So China benefits a lot from that as well. And on the other side, China has been developing rockets very rapidly. For example, this year, the Long March 10 has been tested, and that will be reusable eventually. So hopefully, at some stage, China can, it's a national program, so it's reusable, it's cheap, and also the country is going to be shouldering the cost, not like commercial companies charging a lot of money for it. So in the end, China may be able to provide Europe with a lot of launch power, cheap launch power. So this will be a win-win situation if the two can actually get together and figure out a way to move forward.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
And also, I think Europe also learned some lessons from their previous experience, right? China's exclusion from Europe's Galileo program ultimately pushed it to develop its own Beidou navigation satellite system, which is now a strong global competitor to the US GPS. And the ESA's decision in 2023, I think, to suspend cooperation with China's space station has limited opportunities for scientists from countries like Germany, France, and Italy, who might otherwise have conducted experiments on board. So, Quentin,
Yes.
what's your anticipation there? What could be the next project that both sides can cooperate on?
Well, I think in a more generic sense first, what's happened recently has focused the minds in various national governments around the world and in Europe about who you work with, who you can trust, and where your best options might lie, and the realization that putting all your eggs in one basket is perhaps not the smartest move, and that you need to look for alternatives. And some of that, if you look at what has happened with the China space station, with the Wolf Amendment preventing China from joining the International Space Station. So as was done with Baidu, they just went ahead and did their own. And now you have a cutting-edge, superb Chinese space station against one that's 30 years old and is creaking and leaking and will have to be deorbited, although palatably, from a political perspective, that's not something that America wants. It wants to keep it going for as long as possible so that the Chinese space station isn't the only space station game in town, so to speak. But even there, you look at it, it's cutting edge. So it's got tremendous new technologies. It's finished in its original configuration, but it will grow further and get bigger, I believe. And there are plans for that, I believe. And also, you can dock with it now. I think it was like 2.5 hours, or just over 2.5 hours from launch to enter the space station. Now that can be done compared to 16 to 19 hours for the International Space Station. Lots of advantages there. And so if you lock out China, it seems to me, we'll say, okay, we'll just go and do our own thing anyway, and end up doing it extremely well, and then thinking, well, that was we've actually promoted and so it's like shooting yourself in the foot a bit. If you don't collaborate and cooperate in sensible ways, I think with a major power like China, it can end up actually being counterproductive. You end up not having as many opportunities to collaborate, to participate, to get results and improvements for your own people and for your own country that otherwise would have been there on the table. So I think what's been happening recently may cause some powers to have a recalibration when we're looking at partnering with through an MOU with the Spanish in southern Spain and a space group there for Hong Kong LSR. I mean, we have, my lab partners with countries around the world. We still do. In fact, this November, we have a space mission, a small wide field camera landing on the south polar region of the edge of the Shackleton crater on the moon in November. And that is the only mission, actually, this is interesting, that has any American participation, because it has the International Lunar Observatory Association of Hawaii as a major partner. It was granted to them as an international payload. The LSR Hong Kong U came on board, and we helped to pay for and design the camera that's now flown. So that's an excellent example of a small-scale payload on a major Chang'e 7 lunar mission. And so that's exciting. And then in a couple of years' time, we've been approved for an international payload on Mars, Tianwen 3 sample return with COSPAR in France, with the LSR here in Hong Kong, with Shenzhen University just over the border. And talking about these reusable rockets, Fan said earlier, is that, in fact, there are over 600 aerospace companies in China now. Many of them are spun out from state-owned enterprises, but now becoming commercial enterprises. And new policy directions have come out, 32 new supportive policy directions for the commercialization of aerospace for China. They've just made it a national pillar in the 15th five-year plan, elevating aerospace and new space to a strategic national pillar, even though the fraction of the Chinese economy that is in aerospace and new space is tiny compared to everything else, but they see the future, they see the value, and they said, right, we'll invest, we'll support, we'll get shared facilities for companies to help grow. And it's not just the Long March reusable rockets, but companies like Landspace and others. There's multiple companies now building rockets, some with solid fuel, some will be launched from ships at sea, etc., that are trying to join in this game. Because if they can start to produce constellations like Starlink, that are at a fraction of the cost, that can look at providing decent levels of remote sensing data of importance for agriculture and resource management and monitoring to large swathes of Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and the Middle East, then, you've got a completely different economic model to Starlink that might be a bit better. So there's competition coming.
Right. Seems Quentin has a really comprehensive knowledge of China's current status in space exploration as well as the global landscape. And given what you said, how do you see the balance between competition and cooperation evolving in the future of international space exploration?
This is where I need a crystal ball. So if you can pass me a crystal ball, I'll have a quick look at it. And we'll come
If I
out
try.
Nobody can predict the future. Yes, I can.
We got
I
three
can't.
major players there, right?
Yes, I mean, it's not just about China and America in space. You have the Europeans, which are actually launching the SMILE mission from French Guiana. You have the Indians emerging as a space power. You have Japan already doing quite a lot in space. South Korea developing stuff. Roscosmos still in Russia. So it's not like it's a two-horse race. There are other horses in the field wearing different colors and different jockeys jockeying for position as well.
True.
You might have the two favorites out in front, but you've got a larger field than people realize. And this is where, I think the cooperation can come in. Countries can start to band together, sharing, pooling resources, getting more achieved together than they would on their own, which is always the way. And, the future is in global cooperation. We need it desperately for space sustainability of low Earth orbit. This is where most of our satellites currently go. If that ecosystem, by the way, is destroyed because of the Kessler syndrome, we can't launch SMILE in the future. We can't send people to the moon or to Mars. We can't do anything because we have to get through a debris field and it's too risky. I mean, already rockets aren't 100%. They're only like 98, 99% successful these days. If that was a plane, would you get on a plane where you had a 1% chance that you wouldn't get to the other end? I don't think so. Planes are incredibly safe, the safest form of mass transport we have. But rockets are basically explosives inside a metal tube, jetting into space. And it's been like that for decades. And so until that might change, it's always going to be an inherently risky business.
Yes, there are some players trying to catch up, but the reality is the three major players are leading this game. So, Andy, your take here? Do you have a different opinion?
I think that Quentin, did a great job of talking about that. Maybe if I can look at it from a slightly different perspective,
Sure.
In that, space is the final frontier, right? So there are incredible economic opportunities that are technology based. So we've heard some of them, like colonizing Mars, building data centers in space. And, these are all very, very exciting. But as I talk about in my book, The Innovation Machine, that really, what matters and what we're seeing happen in AI today in the United States is that everyone says, wow, the technology is great. But once we try to deploy it in the enterprise, we have all these problems that can really be described as governance problems. Do you have the right standards? What happens when there's a problem? How do you escalate issues? And that this is something that, China really brings a holistic, comprehensive approach to, whether that's electric vehicles, whether that's artificial intelligence, and I would say also space as well. So in this way, I think, yes, there are multiple players, and we've seen the history of, it was the Soviet Union, the United States, and then China. Now we're seeing more and more countries. But as long as I think everyone can work, and not just countries, but also private enterprise as well. But as long as everyone can work together within a well thought out governance system, that includes standards, includes, codes of conduct, all these other things, then I think, we can address a lot of the challenges, and a lot of these, I think, very exciting things that's in space that people talk about can actually be realized in a scalable way.
Right. I bet the book is worth reading. What's the title again?
It's called The Innovation Machine, How China Creates and Adopts Technology Through Governance.
Right, strongly recommended. And then last question to our two scientists here. I think you've both expressed a willingness or faith in each other, or to work with your counterparts on both sides. But in a world where science has no borders is increasingly challenged as a pseudo proposition, is there anything scientists themselves can do to sustain meaningful international collaboration and keep scientific inquiry above geopolitical divides? Can you further elaborate a little bit on that? Maybe a fund first?
Well, I think it's always been the case that science is without borders. Publication is always public, but scientists are always constrained by national borders, and also politics and all that. So we always have learned how to sort of navigate, to find the path. Scientists are citizens of their individual countries, so that means they shouldn't, even for science, just simply sell out their own countries. They can't be traitors. But on the other hand, we have learned how to find common ground, find this kind of win-win situations, and stay within the allowed sort of legal boundaries to maximize collaboration whenever we could. Sometimes competition is also good. For example, I can go to my funding agency and say they're doing that, we better do that, and they do the same, then both of us getting funded. That does happen, but that's in joke. But anyways, yeah. In the future, there's always going to be a competition, and competition is not necessarily always bad. With competition comes the funding, and cooperation will always end up part of it, especially in science missions, because there are only so many scientists, to be honest. And in some ways, they're all the same group of people because we kind of travel a lot. We do our trainings all over the world. So it's hard to say, the scientists in China are a completely different bunch of people from those in Europe. At one stage, they were European sort of group members. So yeah, it's a people lay down this maze. We're rats which sort of run around in it, and we turned out so far have been reasonably good at doing that.
And Quentin, do we have to all rely on the self-consciousness of scientists, or do we have any other way to solve it?
Competition, I just want to go back to that point about it not always being bad. I mean, for me, it's bad if you're the company that's being competed against by somebody that's better than you. But on the whole, competition is actually, in my opinion, actually really good, because it's a competition that spurs innovation and advancements and better value for customers and maybe lower prices. So I'm a firm believer in the value and importance of competition, including in space and in most areas. I think monopolies are good. Elon Musk's almost got a monopoly for space launches at the moment. If you look at the number of rockets he's putting up every year compared to every other nation, I'm not sure that's all that healthy, but it's a remarkable achievement. And his Falcon X rockets, etc., and the Starships are amazing technology, and they've done an awful lot. But in terms of the future, first of all, I think that scientists need to keep their integrity, try to remain true to their core beliefs as scientists. Not all scientists are good. Some have done very evil things, don't forget, under certain different kinds of jurisdictions they work under in the historical past. Some things are very unethical. And, we're just human beings like everybody else, and with flaws and good pluses and minuses, and with avarice and with greed and egos and all sorts. So, you can't treat scientists like we're a special elevated class that don't suffer from the same flaws as everybody else, because we do. But on a whole, scientists have a more objective and more rational and perhaps more forensic view of the world, and they use the scientific method to perhaps come up with better choices. And so when you're confronted with a world that's so complicated and complex and in some senses you could say pretty dysfunctional right now, I think it behoves us to be prepared to stick up for our core beliefs as scientists, as rational beings, about the importance of shared data, collaboration and competition and win-win, and how you come together and the whole is greater, much greater than the sum of the parts.
And last but not least, Andy, from a, can I say outsider's view here, your take, please.
Sure. And so, I guess to me, it seems that, there are enormous gains from specialization. So I think, if a aerospace scientist, works at the utmost to make breakthroughs in his or her area, right? If someone studying quantum mechanics does the same and, drives the frontier of knowledge and understanding forward, irrespective of what country they're in or, what company they're working for, ultimately, that benefits all of mankind. Because once upon a time, I think in the early days of the internet, people would say, information yearns to be free. And I think that in this way, scientific knowledge diffuses, whether quickly or slowly. So I think, for scientists anywhere around the world, it seems to me that the better, the faster they can come up with breakthroughs, whether theoretical breakthroughs or applied breakthroughs, that really is the best, I think, for all mankind.
And also in space exploration, we reach farther not by pulling apart, but by climbing together. And on that note, we wrap up this session. Many thanks to Professor Andy Mok of Beijing Foreign Studies University, also a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Professor Quentin Parker, the director of the Lab for Space Research, University of Hong Kong, and Professor Zhang Fan, Associate Professor of Astronomy, Beijing Normal University. We'd love to know what you think. Drop us a line anytime at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tu Yuen. Join us for more chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Talk soon.